Hello. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Divinity School, to our wonderful angelic lecture hall. My name is James Robinson. I'm the Dean of Divinity, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the 2023 John Nuveen Lecture. Thank you for all of you being here, including our guests joining us via live stream into the ethosphere. John Nuveen was one of Chicago's most influential business leaders and an active civil and cultural leader with ties to many educational institutions. At the University of Chicago, he served as a trustee, as chairman of the university's Alumni Association, and as a trustee of the Baptist Theological Union, which established the Nuveen Lecture in his honor in 1972. Each year, a prominent member of the faculty is invited by the Baptist Theological Union and the Divinity School to deliver the annual Nuveen Lecture. Past lecturers have included Janet Rowley, Jonathan Lear, Leon Cass, and most recently, last year, Tahira Kutbuddin. Today, I am delighted to welcome my fellow historian, Ada Palmer, Associate Professor of Early Modern European History and a 2021 recipient of the University of Chicago's Llewellyn John and Harriet Manchester Quantrell Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Dr. Palmer, Professor Palmer, Ada, is an accomplished scholar with 2 monographs and a long list of faculty affiliations around the University of Chicago, from classics to the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge. You may also know her as a composer or an acclaimed author of science fiction and fantasy, my favorite genre. In all her creative projects, Ada, Professor Palmer, explores the relationship between ideas and historical change. Similarly, Professor Palmer's work in intellectual history explores how history and thought shape each other over time. Her academic work is focused on the Italian Renaissance, a time when ideas about science, religion, and the world that had developed in the Middle Ages met those of the ancient world, reconstructed from rediscovered sources. Professor Palmer's current research focuses on patterns in the history of the real motives of censors over space and time, from antiquity to the digital age, especially focused on the Inquisition and the early modern censorship, and 20th century censorship of popular media, with special interest in how innovations in information technology trigger waves of new censorship. It is this current research that is the topic of her lecture today. One note, after the lecture, you are all warmly invited to join us in our common room on the first floor, where we will have a dinner reception. But now please join me in welcoming Ada Palmer to deliver the 2023 Nuveen Lecture, Why We Censor from the Inquisition to the Internet.
As a preface, knowing that the acoustics of this room can be difficult, this is the international diving hand gesture for octopus, which in my choir we use for "you need better diction." If at any point I start going too fast or my diction becomes poor enough that the acoustics of the room are difficult, please put your hand up and give me the octopus of diction, and that will remind me to slow down and enunciate carefully. A very useful gesture, especially in drafty lecture halls. So, thank you all, and thank you for the wonderful welcome. Censorship is a topic far from the lofty delights of studying religion, philosophy, and the exquisite panorama of human belief and inquiry. But today, censorship is around us, bearing down on institutions of higher education, on politics, on people, on our global order, and on the global understandings of religion, since religious movements and religious institutions are so often either fomenters and beneficiaries of censorious movements, and just as often targets or victims of the same. So while this will be a very worldly talk for a Divinity School talk, speaking of lived atrocities and political activism, in a crisis, when institutions like this one are under direct assault, every intellectual is of necessity a public intellectual. Every work we write an apologia for human inquiry itself and for these institutions which seek to serve and foster it. And as public intellectuals, it is not enough for us to empower our scholarship with the latest tools of research, theory, and discourse. We must also bulwark our scholarship and ourselves with the best possible apparatus for applying our work to and defending it from the slings and arrows of truly outrageous fortune. From Facebook's Censorship Advisory Council to the Great Firewall of China, to the latest American school and library book bans advanced in the names of morality and religion, censorship projects are metastasizing around us daily, and we cannot resist them, understand them, or protect legitimate theological and ethical discourse from their poison unless we understand the real motives of censors. Part 1. The imagined censor. Winston Smith sets out in the morning for his job in the records department at the Ministry of Truth. He will spend his day combing through newspapers and archival material to edit speeches, falsify predictions, erase murdered persons, and invent false pasts that serve the state, while his colleagues in the ministry churn out propaganda and mindless entertainment and edit and overwrite the works of Shakespeare. Winston's Ministry of Truth is an enormous, quote, enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete soaring up terrace after terrace, end quote, dominating the landscape and employing thousands of citizens. It has perfect access to all media, a budget so vast that it can dedicate an entire team to surveilling the thoughts and actions of each citizen like Winston. It is effective, inescapable, driven by the will to power, as Orwell puts it, a boot stomping on a human face forever. And it is entirely impossible. Eileen Blair bids good morning to her husband Eric, better known as George Orwell, as she sets out for her real job in the real censorship department of the Ministry of Information in London, which during the Second World War was located here in the Senate House of the University of London, the model for Orwell's Ministry of Truth. Eileen, a former journalist and editor with a degree in educational psychology, who, with her husband, had worked for the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War, will spend her day going through private correspondence, cutting out sensitive content, especially references to troop movements, names of specific personnel or prisoners, discussions of resources, or reflections on morale, which could be revealing to the enemy. The task is a huge one, and Britain's wartime Ministry of Information is desperate for funding and perpetually understaffed, recruiting women, students still in school, anyone they can. They are constantly backlogged, driven by desperation and the frantic desire to survive against an overwhelming enemy. Our real censor, Eileen, has a mix of motives, including patriotism, fear, the basic need to earn a salary, and the public around her views her work with a mixture of wariness, gratitude, acceptance, and curiosity about the psychological experience of being a censor. Do you ever think of the censor, writes Sylvia Townsend Warner to her friend, composer Paul Nordhoff, in a letter she knows will be read by censors like Eileen? Rooms full of ladies and gentlemen all engaged in the embarrassing occupation of reading other people's letters. What will they do when they can't be censors any longer? Will they pine and languish and find themselves suddenly cut off from humanity? Or will they demonstrate their freedom by never opening another envelope, not even envelopes addressed to them? For wartime Britain, rooms of ladies and gentlemen engaged in a strange and awkward occupation is an entirely accurate description of Aileen's work. And in fact, wartime censors were so counter to the way we imagine censorship operating, they sometimes went so far as to add information. In this letter from an American First World War soldier, Jim Thierfilder, to his fiancée back at home, he described his location simply as somewhere over there, self-censoring his whereabouts, knowing that they aren't allowed to be in the letter. But the censor added in a note saying he can tell this person in England. Thierfilder's letters to his fiancée, collected letters, also feature numerous comments where he or his fiancée, straying toward romantic topics in their letter or toward sexuality, cut themselves off with, "But I'll spare the poor censor." This polite, sensitive imagined censor is not in most of our minds when we imagine a censor today. Orwell's 1984 gave us an invaluable vocabulary for thinking about censorship, surveillance, and totalitarianism, terms used around the globe and recognizable by millions more than have read the original novel. So iconic is 1984 that when people perceive a crisis, they reach for it as a tool and rallying cry, as we have seen in the current authoritarian surge. As alarm bells go off in us the instant we see censorship that resembles Orwell. And this creates a corresponding lack of activation when we see forms of censorship which don't resemble Orwell. Corporate censorship, popular censorship, censorship demanded bottom-up by parents, teachers, or profit-seeking industries. These are also major shapers of censorship past and present. And we need to bring these motives into our understanding of the drives behind censorship if we want to understand what is happening today in the authoritarian surge and its intersection with the current information revolution. The importance of understanding censors' motives crystallized for me in a class discussion here at UChicago a few years ago. Meeting in Regenstein Library's Rare Books room, we were comparing two volumes. One is this controversial medical work by Girolamo Cardano, which was condemned by the Inquisition. And in this copy, a professional inquisitor has faithfully removed the forbidden passages. The arrow points to where the inquisitor's signature and note on the title page certify the volume as correctly censored. We paired this volume with this copy of the third Twilight novel, in which the mother of the then underage owner of the book cut out the sex scene with scissors and used a combination of Sharpie and whiteout to efface the explicit language. This is precisely the same physical act, cutting out pages and obscuring text. And our discussion centered on why our responses to the two acts feel so different in the case of the two texts. There are many different reasons, the power dynamics involved, the gender of the author, the gender of the audience, the way we value philosophy versus the way we value romantic literature. But one student's comment struck me. The difference, this student said, is that the mother believes she's doing something good. Of course, it took only seconds for other students in the class to say, but wait, the inquisitor also believes he's doing something good, that he's protecting Catholic readers against a dangerous heresy. He thinks that is a good act, just as the mother thinks that she is protecting her daughter, just as those who demand the censorship of Facebook or comic books or film, or who printed this Baudelarized family Shakespeare with the naughty bits taken out, believe that they are doing something good. But the student's first impulse in that first comment is very telling. We have an expectation that bad censors, like the Inquisition, know they are bad. that they are motivated by malice, by the will to cause pain, by the will to power, by Orwell's iron boot stomping a human face forever. In our society, we tend to instinctively call things censorship primarily when we perceive those involved to have bad intentions, and to excuse or discount censorious actions when we perceive the motives to be good. To understand how real censorship works, we need to thank Orwell for the tools he's given us, but also push back and reintroduce the fact that most censorship is not motivated by a sinister, self-conscious will to power and cause pain, but by other motives such as the desire to protect, a sense of crisis, fear, patriotism, or even sometimes love. This letter, sent from the trenches by First World War poet Wilfred Owen, looks like it passed through the same censoring process which employed Eileen Blair. But the black ink you see here is no state censor. It's the poet's brother Harold, who censored his brother Wilfred's letters before their publication. Harold's later autobiography explains that he censored the passages to protect personal details about friends and family, but researcher Jean Cannon and a research team at the Harry Ransom Center have shown that Harold actually mainly sought to conceal Wilfred's shell shock symptoms and excise references to mental illness because of the stigma attached to it. Love, the desire to protect a reputation, to craft a reputation. These motives mingle in cases like the Owen letters, or the letters of Renaissance radical Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, whose nephew excised radical content before publishing them during the early Reformation, changing invocations of God's plural to God singular, and making the works seem to support his own Protestant sympathies. Even the infamous interventions of Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche, inserting anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi sentiments into her incapacitated brother's works during his long period of disability incapacitation in the latter part of his life, mixed ideology and white supremacy with family bonds and motives of twisted caregiving, the desire to make her brother's legacy shine in what she thought would be a grand new Nazi-dominated era. And while the Telegraph here is quick to call Foster Nietzsche's alterations to her brother's work criminal, the legality of this kind of intervention is, like most private censorship, messy at best. But the consequences make this perhaps one of the most influential interventions by a woman in political thought in the last 200 years. As you can tell from my including Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche in my list, I am defining the scope of censorship very broadly, including not only government action, but private censorship, civilian bodies created to rate or censor media, public efforts to exclude books or schools from schools or communities, and corporate censorship, both profit-seeking and political. Not everyone defines censorship so broadly. In fact, there has been a subtle but telling multi-year battle in Wikipedia's page on censorship in the United States, in which activists from the American Library Association Office for Intellectual Freedom worked to defend the page's coverage of private censorship against opponents who insist that, as you see here, only state action is real censorship and that any analysis, such as the report cited here from the watchdog group Reporters Without Borders, which claims that America has anything but perfect free speech, is invalid because only state action is censorship. It's valuable to examine how state and private censorship differ, but for me, one fact makes the idea that we should study state censorship as the only censorship an absurd non-starter. The Inquisition was not the state. It wasn't. It was an international organization aiming at universal authority, but negotiating with local governments and rulers, sometimes collaborating, but just as often competing with local powers, and using the international apparatus of organizations, such as the Dominicans and Jesuits, to cross borders and set up local operations. In short, an organization less like a state than like Doctors Without Borders or UNICEF, and with the same belief that it was doing something good. The pre-modern Inquisition was also radically plural, with decentralized local chapters spread around Europe's global empires and with radically different policies and operations. For example, while inquisitors in 17th century Central America funded translations of religious material into indigenous languages and spent many more hours ensuring the accuracy of indigenous dictionaries than they did policing radical Enlightenment texts that were streaming in at the same time, inquisitors at that same moment in Portuguese-controlled Goa in Western India ordered the eradication of all texts in indigenous languages and the blanket burning of all Sanskrit writings and Konkani writings, regardless of content. There is no consistency to Inquisition policy. In fact, the more I study the Inquisition, the less I like using the word in the singular at all to describe a set of operations which enacted conflicting policies, published competing lists of banned material, and often overlapped with multiple inquisitors authorized by different branches operating in the same space and overriding each other. For example, in colonial Mexico City, where inquisitors from Jesuit and Dominican branches competed with each other and with governors for the Spanish crown and with orders from Rome, a situation which resulted in 4 conflicting overlapping inquisitions, easily gamed by those who had the right cunning or connections to go to mom when dad says no. These plural inquisitions were sometimes funded by states, sometimes co-opted by states, sometimes opposed by states, used by states to scapegoat adversaries, but they were not the state. In fact, strange as it is, nothing in the United States First Amendment would prevent the Inquisition from operating in the U.S. right now, since there are legal precedents for private prisons and private police forces in the U.S., and it could authorize an Inquisition to have such things in exactly the same way it authorizes corporations. The Inquisition did operate in the U.S., claiming force of law over American Catholics, enforceable by excommunication into the 1960s. And Catholic students at our own university had to get notes of permission from a bishop to do their homework in the core if professors assigned Thomas Hobbes, listed in the up-to-date 1948 Index of Prohibited Books. Censorship is often plural, often private, often popular, and we learn more about its motives from studying the private citizen who chooses to attend a book burning than we do from Orwell's imaginary O'Brien. The Inquisition was a perpetrator of terrible atrocities and one of history's most prominent censoring bodies. Indeed, the imaginary Hollywood version of the Inquisition, shaped heavily by propaganda, both Catholic and anti-Catholic, is the second greatest influence on the way we imagine censorship after Orwell. The Inquisition is also Earth's most infamous manifestation of the common phenomenon of religion and its institutions being co-opted and transformed into an anxiety-generating engine, which in turn can be wielded by institutions, authorities, or individuals to advance and indeed agendas as well as atrocities. But the real Inquisitions were as horrible as we imagine, and yet, this is the important part, they were nowhere near as organized as we imagine them to be, nowhere near as consistent, and nowhere near as focused on the destruction of information. Different goals channeled and shaped the anxious and exploitable religious energy which powered the Inquisitions. A quick and dirty institutional history of the plural Inquisitions will show the first of several important patterns shared by many censoring bodies. Number one, that they tend not to be created intentionally for a particular pre-planned out project. Rather, censoring bodies tend to be hastily improvised as responses to a perceived crisis, often repurposing existing infrastructure. The First Inquisition was created in the 1100s when authorities in France demanded a legal framework to combat the Cathar and Waldensian movements, a conflict that was partly theological but very substantially political and about taxation. And the international infrastructure of the Dominican order was then repurposed for this task of oppression. By 1252, the Pope authorized the use of torture by inquisitors, and local branches were then adapted to new uses by local interests, including witchcraft trials, the policing of public morals, and the oppression of local political dissidents. This infrastructure proved ideal when Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain wanted to persecute former Jews and Muslims in the later 1400s. When the printing press then came along and Rome issued its 1515 order that all books be examined by the church authorities before publication, the Inquisition already existed. It had not been about book censorship before, but was repurposed for book censorship at this moment. The Reformation then kicked that into high gear, leading to the creation of a centralized Holy Office of the Inquisition in 1542, the first point at which anybody thought that making this already centuries-old thing a permanent established part of the church would be necessary. Everyone thought each Inquisition would be temporary until that crisis was fulfilled. But once the apparatus exists, it can be repurposed. In later centuries, Inquisition infrastructure continued to be repurposed as each new perceived crisis loomed, from Galileo to Darwinism to communism, all wholly unrelated to the medieval theological and political disputes of southeastern France. But once created, the Inquisition was there to be repurposed time and again. This pattern holds broadly. Governments and popular movements facing a perceived crisis, which may or may not be a real crisis, often tend to repurpose extant infrastructure for censorious ends, even if the original tool was not intended for censorship. For example, one major crisis in censorship history came with the invention of talkies, films in which people talked, which meant suddenly there could be bad words in film. This caused a moral panic. Many countries, including New Zealand, Australia, and the USA, repurposed their postal customs systems and their post office inspectors to search for film reels as well as for nude photographs and photography in order to intercept, destroy materials, and punish the creators and circulators of them without having to create new infrastructure or pass new laws. They just reused the post office. Similarly, in one of the grimmest memories of modern New Zealand, the 1951 dock workers' strike. During World War II, dock workers in New Zealand had worked 15-hour days without extra pay because the island nation depended on its ports. And when peace came, shipping companies kept demanding the same hours without more pay. When dock workers went on strike, the government took advantage of not yet repealed emergency sedition laws left over from the war to declare it sedition for newspapers or individuals to praise or support striking workers or even give them food. Closer to home, in the same year, at the University of Chicago, we censored the Maroon newspaper. The student editor Alan D. Kimmel had attended a communist world youth rally in East Berlin over the summer, and as he returned, even in the same moment that UChicago was fiercely defending its communist sympathizing faculty, the dean of students stripped the Maroon of its funding and shut the newspaper down, saying he would reinstate it only if they replaced the editor. After weeks of protests by students and a long sit-in and journalistic coverage nationwide, the Maroon yielded, and the editor left. In fact, he was also kicked out of his PhD program. I forget whether it was anthropology or sociology, but he was immediately adopted by the other department and given the same standing. Because the University of Chicago never makes internally consistent decisions. Each section always has its own power. The budgeting of student clubs was never intended as a tool for censorship, nor were New Zealand's wartime sedition laws intended to weaken unions, nor was the U.S. Patriot Act, passed during 9/11, intended to target immigrants and DACA children. Nor did the medieval Frenchmen who asked the Pope to create a tool for them to persecute Cathars imagine that it would someday be used to persecute scientists or undiscovered peoples far across the seas. These cases show us two principles of censorship. First, that a large portion of censorship is carried out by reusing institutions or policies that were never intended to censor, like the post office or the funding of school clubs. And second, that once created, a censoring tool will be reused later to censor different things. And when we feel the impulse to create a system that can silence something that makes us uncomfortable, we must always ask ourselves, how will this tool be misused in future by people I do not agree with? To give two further examples, in 1954, a moral panic came to its peak in the Anglosphere with an obsession with the claim that violent and sexually explicit comic books were causing a so-called epidemic of juvenile delinquency. England, New Zealand, and Australia set up government systems to censor comic books. But the USA was restricted by the First Amendment, so it had to find a workaround by having Congress pressure comic book companies to voluntarily create the Comics Code Authority, a civilian organization which screened and censored comics before their printing, giving them a seal of approval, which then allowed comics to be sold in shops. Created in the 50s to police violent and sexually explicit images, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Comics Code censors began nitpicking more severely with comics that had positive depictions of black characters, declaring overly graphic images as innocuous as a bead of sweat on the forehead of a black astronaut, and making comics which had black heroes and heroines more likely to need to redraw pages, exceed budgets, miss deadlines, lose money, and face cancellation. Not at all what the Comics Code was created to censor, but it was easy to reuse. More recently, in 1990, Australia introduced an internet censorship system designed to block child pornography sites, in which government employees were hired to identify sites that listed child pornography and add them to a blacklist, which would then block them from the Australian internet. The list was secret, since if it were public, it would be a giant list of child porn sites, which nobody wanted to make available. But when watchdog organizations noticed discrepancies between the number of blocked sites and reports of prosecutions of such sites, that and other pressures got the government to change this system and eventually reveal the old list. When it was examined, 90% of blocked sites were not child pornography. I'm going to repeat that. These censors were hired to censor one specific thing, and 90% of what they secretly censored was not that thing. It was unrelated things that they personally felt were bad. Adult pornography, violent images, LGBT sites, suicide guides, marijuana growing instructions, bomb making instructions, terrorist group recruitment videos, numerous things that make people feel legitimately uncomfortable. But it led these well-meaning Australian censors to overstep by 90% the purview of their legally mandated office. These cases both remind us of our conclusion that most people who censor believe they are protecting someone and believe that they are doing good, and therefore their actions cannot be bad censorship. I want to dig a little deeper now into the Inquisitions. which certainly believed they were protecting something. And we can learn more about the motives of censors from their actual lived actions. The first, and in many ways weirdest thing we learn by looking at what inquisitors actually spent their time doing is that the Inquisition's goal was never to destroy information. Look again at this Cardano treatise, the one we compared to Twilight. It took a professional inquisitor hours, if not days, to go through this text using the index which specifies exactly which passages were to be excised, patiently scratching through each line and preserving the rest of the book. It would have taken seconds to throw this book in the fire. Roman Inquisition documents constantly opine that they don't have enough funds, they don't have enough people, they plead desperately to local governments to cooperate, to lend them troops, to let them use cells, which the Inquisition did not have the money to have for itself. This is the Roman Inquisition, not the Spanish Inquisition under Ferdinand and Isabella, whose anxieties about an imagined fifth column led them to shower their local Inquisition with funds to use against their perceived enemies. This was the Roman Inquisition, so overwhelmed by a tsunami of Protestant heterodoxies that by the mid-1500s, the project to publish and continually update an official index of forbidden authors, such as Martin Luther and Melanchthon, who you see listed here, immediately had to resort to desperate shortcuts, such as condemning Erasmus, but elaborating that most of his works could still be used, because Orthodox institutions could not make do without Europe's most popular textbook author. And even vaguer steps, such as condemning anything written in defense of Zwingli, generically, even if they didn't know who the authors were or there were too many to elaborate. Later versions of the index, knowing that it would be out of date by the time it was printed, resorted to such blanket categories as condemning all works dedicated to specific pro-Lutheran rulers. Or, my favorite, anything printed on a printing press that had printed the works of Martin Luther, since such a press was thus contaminated, and more practically was in fact likely to be printing other Protestant authors. To make matters even more complicated, rival indexes were being printed by competing inquisitions, especially the better-funded inquisitions of Spain and Portugal, whose inconsistent judgments Rome raced to keep up with. There was a period when Rome published books which were guides for inquisitors on how to bluff if they met people who were using way more advanced Spanish indexes of banned books, and they had to pretend they knew who these authors were. There were actual printed guides to bluffing your way through the fact that Spain's Inquisition is miles ahead of your own Inquisition. In the middle of such a crisis, to invest hours or days in expurgating a single book of Cardano instead of throwing it on the fire shows an enormous value placed on all the rest of the pages of this book, and a strong desire to err on the side of keeping, not to err on the side of destroying. The Roman Inquisition and other branches, even tiny ones like this adorable Inquisition branch on the island of Malta, also kept copies of banned books for their own use and the use of experts, creating reference libraries of forbidden books. Inquisitors used these collections to identify books, banned texts if they had fake titles, and to compare new suspect authors to old ones, since if a book echoed ideas that had already been condemned, it made it an easy thing to condemn the new one. They needed the banned books, so accumulating new books, including and especially forbidden books, was a positive and necessary act when done correctly by the guidelines of these inquisitions. Private individuals could also apply to the inquisitions for a license to own and read banned books. Applicants would explain their reasons. For example, a doctor might request to read the medical works of Protestant author Leonard Fuchs, or Pliny the Elder, whose natural histories had been condemned for a two-sentence passage denying the immortal soul. The applicant would write up an explanation for why he needed the books, promise to ignore the heretical content and focus only on medical information, and receive such a license, which could be issued by local inquisitors, bishops, Vatican envoys, even secular rulers with papal recognition, so that many overlapping authorities, that anyone rejected by one office could quickly turn to another. And the fees from this licensing process became a major income stream for underfunded Inquisition branches. My good friend Hannah Marcus at Harvard, in the History of Science program, who's a collaborator of mine, examined over 5,000 of these licenses issued mainly to medical doctors, and found that repeat applicants who would return to renew their license after 3 years of expiration would often coast on that trust to, I requested medical books the first time, now I'm going to request medical books and the Decameron. Now I'm going to request medical books and the Decameron and some pornography, and they would often get permission. This practice does not aim to destroy information. It aims to curate access, creating concentric circles in which elites, such as doctors, inquisitors themselves, or monastic orders, have greater access than others. Lucretius's epic poem, the De Rerum Natura, is another scientific work which denies the immortal soul, and its association with infamous radicals such as Pomponio Leto, who was arrested and tortured and accused of trying to assassinate the Pope. Despite this, Lucretius was not banned, and in fact we even have a letter of Inquisitor General Michele Ghiglieri discussing Lucretius as an example of a book which doesn't need to be banned because, quote, everyone knows to read it as a mere fable. But when a century later Alessandro Marchetti, a mathematician and critic of Galileo, translated Lucretius from edifying and difficult Latin verses into easy vernacular Italian, Marchetti was denied permission to publish, and when the work was published anyway after his death in 1714 with a false London imprint to conceal what is probably actually a Venetian production, only then was the long infamous Lucretius finally banned by Rome. This 1564, there's the London thing. This is, by the way, in Italian, on Italian paper, in an Italian typeface, with London spelled the Italian way. They just printed it in Venice, put it on a boat, went around in a circle, unloaded it, and claimed that it came from London. I love when they do that. This 1564 classroom edition of Lucretius even specifies in the introduction that the text should be taught in Latin courses specifically to make sure that vulnerable youths encounter its dangerous ideas in class with a teacher as chaperone instead of on their own in the wild. The logic is that readers are in a hierarchy of trust, with mature Latin reading experts expected to be resistant to dangerous ideas, elite students a little more vulnerable, and the less educated public who has to read a translation, they are the vulnerable ones. They may not have the text at all. Hierarchies of trust like this are visible all over Inquisition practice. As Hannah Marcus once put it to me over coffee, any doctor could get Pliny, but if you wanted Galileo, you'd better be a Jesuit or a king, or you're not getting it. But if you were, yeah, you could have it. And rulers could demand that local Inquisition chapters, dependent for their funds on dukes and administrators, give permission not just to the royal family to have forbidden books, but for their librarians to have permission to share banned book with anyone the Duke admitted to court, creating islands of elite access supervised by the state, which the Inquisition hated and complained about, but could not prevent. This access for the elites and silence for the masses is an exact parallel to how in the USSR, when works like Plato and Shakespeare were purged from Soviet libraries, copies were kept in elite libraries for the use of inner party members. a project overseen by Nadezhda Karybskaya, the main architect of Soviet book censorship. Similarly, in China today, elite universities and inner party members are given freer access to uncensored internet. In sum, many censorship projects do not aim to destroy information. They aim to curate access, segregating readers into groups of greater and lesser trust, be those nobility and commoners, inner party and masses, or adults and children. Back to the Inquisition. One thing they could do, even if kings complained, was set conditions on accessing these banned books. One common requirement for securing a license was owners promising to expurgate or black out certain parts of the book. In this medical text, doctors have been required to efface the author's name and even his image, a kind of damnatio memoriae which leaves the content untouched. Cutting the condemned name out of headers with scissors was another practice, or even a condemned place. There's a period when they cut the word Amsterdam out of books printed in Amsterdam. Extra hilarious because at that point 60% of all books in Europe were printed in Amsterdam. Here in Erasmus's edition of Horace, you can see that his name has been effaced and his commentary symbolically crossed out, but left entirely legible for the use of the Jesuit schoolmaster. The hours spent by owners crossing out name after name, the reading process, seeing this ritual defacement, this is not about destroying information. It's about drilling in the lesson that the heretic is bad and dangerous, as a teacher might have a wayward student copy a didactic mantra on a chalkboard. This 16th century encyclopedia of animals, which is in Regenstein by prolific scholar Conrad Gesner, Anne Blair at Harvard has wonderful work on Gesner. You see here on the title page a professional inquisitor's note, cum expurgatione, confirming that expurgation has been completed. This work is packed with, there's the signature, images of animals. Isn't that a wonderful beaver there at the top? Images of creatures which have no content related to the fact that Gesner is a Protestant. This could not be a more secular book. But the Inquisition, nonetheless, ordered a very thorough expurgation, so complicated that Gesner's entry in the index spans multiple pages. What needs to be crossed out from our Encyclopedia of Animals? Often Gesner's name. Here you see it not only crossed out in the lower one, but transformed into gibberish in the upper one in order to keep the book looking pretty. However, like a good scholar, Gesner credits his sources. Each entry, have a nice guinea pig, each entry thanking the learned and excellent Dr. So-and-so who sent Gesner a drawing of this guinea pig. And the Inquisition's command is that a Catholic reader, if he wants to have this book, may have the image, may have the text, may even have the name of the scholar who sent Gesner the drawing of the guinea pig. But if the scholar being thanked is Protestant, the reader must black out learned and excellent. Protestants are not learned and excellent, is the Inquisition's lesson. Protestants are bad and wrong. And going through thousands of pages of this encyclopedia, blacking out praise of Protestants over and over, transforms this completely secular text into a didactic tool, reinforcing the confessional divide. Every time you, the owner, cross out a name, every time you turn a page and see that black ink, bad and wrong, you are reminded of the supposed danger of straying close to heretics, the power and vigilance of this censoring authority that is trying to protect you. This policy, having people, and especially professional inquisitors do this, is absurd if the goal of the Inquisition is to destroy information. Instead, it is to affect thought by continually projecting power. This is why it strives to be so visible, not concealing its presence, but declaring its presence and covering pages with visible black marks, instead of cleanly cutting pages away. Censorship often wants to be visible, like the Comics Code Authority or the Movie Ratings Board or the Great Firewall of China and many other internet censorship, which could easily, like Winston's Ministry of Truth in 1984, conceal the fact that it's blocking a website by making it seem to be an internet bug or making it seem to route to the wrong page. But to the contrary, such programs choose to make visible the gaps and warnings, reminding you many times a day of the presence of the censoring power. Book burnings, in the past as today, are also usually about projecting power, not about destroying information. Post-printing press, it became effectively impossible to eradicate a text, no matter how hard one tried. Gregory VII, back in the 6th century, could aspire to effectively eradicate Sappho. That succeeded, and only a few fragments survive. But the eradication of 6 manuscripts, when something exists in only 6 manuscripts, is very different from the eradication of the hundreds of copies that come off of a printing press. The eradication of a printed book after dissemination is impossible. And book burnings, while still a core practice, transformed into a primarily symbolic act about projecting rejection, focusing on destroying symbolic things or sometimes on destroying a specific unique archive, such as a state archive or a community archive. None of these types of book burnings aspire to destroy every copy of a text. So, for example, fascist-led book burnings within Jewish communities did not imagine they were going to destroy every copy of the Talmud or any other major Jewish work. Their goal is to terrorize communities, disable study and research, and send a message of hostility. Just as the people who burn Harry Potter or 50 Shades of Grey know they are not burning every copy and will never get to. The only moment in which one can eradicate a book post-printing press is by intercepting the edition before it reaches booksellers. But even this pretty much always fails. This 18th century volume is a criticism of Jesuit education by Portuguese Enlightenment leader Luís Antônio Vernet, and was printed in Italy, in Naples, and intercepted by the Jesuit-run Portuguese Inquisition in the port in Lisbon as it arrived before it was distributed. They were warned that this was going to come in on a ship. They intercepted the ship in the port, and the entire print run was destroyed by the Inquisition as it came off the boat, leaving only the printer's original in faraway Naples. Nonetheless, a second edition was printed in Portugal within 2 months. How? This is before Naples had time to send another copy. The answer is one of the inquisitors kept a copy, read it, liked it, smuggled it, and printed it himself, an Enlightenment sympathizer working within the system. Censors themselves were, after all, intellectuals, trained on the latest works of literature and with access to radical materials. So they were often themselves a point of permeability where control broke down. In France, as Paris grew as a printing and intellectual capital, and royal pressure transferred censorship work from the Inquisition to Inquisition-licensed royal censors, working as a royal censor was basically an easy first job for a lit major out of college, employing numerous young intellectuals educated in the same circles that produced Voltaire, whose day job it was to censor books while writing their own books by night. Robert Darnton, whose work I cannot recommend enough if you just enjoy a good history pleasure read, has found cases where radical-leaning censors shepherd each other's college roommates' works through the process, literally writing to each other, "Jacques, I got your book to censor. Don't worry, I'll do a really good job." French royal censors sympathetic to the Enlightenment project intentionally let the famous Encyclopédie be printed freely, turning a blind eye to its radicalism. And 7 volumes had to come out before they got to Rome, and Rome's understaffed censors finally caught up and banned it as of the letter H. Even then, French inspectors were so sympathetic that they let later volumes, here you can see the Paris one on the left, and we just started printing an anonymous independent encyclopedia in the same format, beginning at the letter H, that came out of the Swiss Republic after the ban. They liked these books so much that the people at the border whose job it was to look for contraband would notice the encyclopedia being smuggled and let it through so reliably that more radical works, such as revolutionary tracts or de Sade's pornography, were regularly smuggled into France by wrapping them in copies of the encyclopedia, knowing it would get through, wrapping a banned book in another banned book, but knowing that the permeability could be exploited. Another pattern in censorship systems is that they're often made permeable by sympathetic actors on the inside. This, in particular, is why the transition to digital censorship with unmanned filters is so alarming, since one of the greatest salvations we have had from censorship regime in the past has been the human nature of censors themselves, their intellectual leanings and their willingness to be permeable and sympathetic, something that an algorithm will not do. Removing the human element, even though means that even though the information experts programming algorithms may be sympathetic to letting information through, nonetheless, they're less likely to be able to craft systems that have human permeability. Meanwhile, the pattern remains that elites who believe themselves to be safe possessing things will allow those they trust to have access while denying access to the masses. Since time grows short, I'm going to, elite students, yes. Since time goes short, I'm going to review some of these patterns. But first I need to touch briefly on two patterns in censorship that I haven't yet come to. First, a lot of censorship is enabled by people who don't care about the ideology but believe they can benefit from stirring up anxiety. Be it the American and British politicians in 1954 who realized they could ride the tide of the moral panic over comic books into elected office, or digital giants like Disney and Facebook who engineered the new EU censorship laws, which claimed to be about protecting kids and protecting artists, but snuck in language designed to protect their monopolies, to the current moral panics being stirred up in the US by politicians who expect their censorship legislation to be torn down by courts, but know that simply having passed it or even proposed it will win the acclaim of their voter base. Many groups with little or no interest in the ideology benefiting from harvesting the power of what we can call grassroots anxiety or grassroots desire to censor things we hate and fear. In fact, that impulse is the very root of our copyright system. There was no copyright when printing began, and the Inquisition created the first copyright, offering monopoly licenses to printers as a reward for the printer cooperating with the censorship system. By the early 1600s, English printers outside of the jurisdiction of any Inquisition were annoyed and envious of this and wanted a similar system to protect their monopolies on texts. So the Stationers' Company, a powerful printing guild, intentionally stirred up public anxiety about Catholic plots to foment evil overthrow of the government in order to cause public demand for a censoring system, which the Stationers' Guild would then administer by volunteering to inspect all books before publication, charging a hefty fee for the process. This is the moment that sparked the first major public discussions of freedom of the press, including John Milton's famous Areopagitica and Charles Blount's Vindication of Learning and the Liberty of the Press. And the licensing regime advanced by the stationer's company in order to skim money off of competitors by stirring up public anxiety then grew into what became copyright. By the way, this is on the left is the first ever legal case over copyright. The very first copyright suit ever is one printer suing another for reprinting the account of a man being put on trial for publishing banned books. Censorship and copyright entangled all the way down. As for the issue of information revolutions, that's the final important ingredient I wanted to bring up. One reason that there was so much fear of Catholic or other radical voices in Milton's day is that he was living in an information revolution, just as we are living in an information revolution. And information revolutions amplify the most frightening voices in societies, often sparking fear-mongering and what we might call grassroots or bottom-up calls for censorship. My colleague Kathleen Belew, who actually just left and is now at Northwestern, works on white supremacy and hate groups in the USA, and she refers to this very aptly as the early adopter effect. Adopting a new information technology has a cost, whether the expense of setting up a new machine or buying a new computer or printer or software, or a cost in time, enduring the trial and error period of a changing audience, or even just the frustration of learning a new system. I'm sure you've all had the experience of hearing someone recommend Blue Sky or Discord or Mastodon and gone, ugh, not another one. That is a cost of a new information technology. First adopters of new information technologies must have strong reasons to make this leap, and thus are usually groups that are not being served by the current technology, which always includes groups who are being censored. Kathleen did brilliant work on the Ditto machine. We all remember Ditto machines, which during the mid-20th century caused a revolution in inexpensive small-scale printing. The newsletters created by Ditto machines became enormous enablers of community formation for many groups, including aquarium hobbyists, Trekkies, civil rights activists, immigrant groups, and linguistic minorities. Some of the first language minority newspapers were produced via the Ditto machine. LGBT communities used them heavily, and so did the KKK, whose growth over the 20th century from near dissolution to its present resurgence can be traced to, among other factors, a resurgence through Ditto newsletters. Early adopters of information technologies fill each new platform with their previously silenced messages. And the groups that authorities and publics find most alarming are therefore always among the first and most conspicuous users of new media, prompting fear and consequent demands for censorship. Each new system isn't yet good at censorship, so the things that were silenced by the old system are loud and scary being enabled by the new system. The licensing acts requiring printed material to be inspected by the Inquisition or other authorities during the print revolution had exactly the same cause as current demands for Facebook or Twitter to censor hate groups and so-called fake news. And such calls come from both frightened publics and powerful forces harvesting that public anxiety for profit or political gain. So, let's return to Orwell. If the Ministry of Truth exercises power which is centralized, top-down, power-seeking, carrying out a stable multi-year plan, and has an infinite budget and staff dedicated to destroying information and encouraging self-censorship, real censorship, in contrast, tends to be decentralized, with plural decision makers necessitated by imperfect communication, like the plural Inquisition branches, with many opportunities for inconsistencies exploited by local actors, good and bad. It tends to be bottom-up or grassroots in origin, often demanded by public fear, whether of Protestantism, communism, or comic books, and tends to be amplified by information revolutions. Real censorship tends to be motivated by the desire to protect, seeing itself as preventing harm, not an iron boot, but a gentle hug. While other motives such as profit or power seeking tend to hide behind the excuse of protecting others, while those with other motives get to deny that they are doing bad censorship. Real censorship tends to repurpose earlier infrastructure and to be hastily improvised in response to a perceived crisis, whether a world war or the many crises that shaped the Inquisition. It tends to be short of staff and funds, resorting to extreme and symbolic tools such as book burning. There, the round images you see are banned jazz circulating on bootleg records made out of X-ray films in the USSR in the period when jazz was illegal, but you can use an old X-ray film to create an LP. And these circulated widely, as the USSR well knew, but it used symbolic destruction of material to discourage and frighten. Real censorship tends to aim, instead of destroying information, to instead limit and curate access, controlling who has access to what, covering media with permissions, restrictions, and ritual reminders of authority, and transforming the consumption of text or image into a tool of power. This serves the major trait shared between real censors and the Ministry of Truth, that projecting power, reminding people of their presence, aims less to destroy past work than to dominate present and future work by encouraging the only kind of censorship that can destroy all copies of something: self-censorship. When we look at the most infamous Inquisition trial of all time, that of Galileo, it was an utter failure if we presume that the Inquisition's goal was to silence Galileo. If that had been the goal, making Galileo quietly disappear would have been a better tactic, as Orwell well knew. This is the Italian Renaissance. Murder is easy. They could have poisoned him. This is a solved problem. What the Galileo trial did was succeed at frightening Descartes into delaying the publication of his nearly finished new synthesis and revising it to be much more orthodox, transforming his legacy into something that reinforced Catholic authority, just as Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche transformed her brother's legacy. Hence my biggest conclusion: the majority of censorship is self-censorship. But the majority of self-censorship is intentionally cultivated by an outside power. Power is not the end necessarily, it is the means to what censors are convinced to see as a good or protective act. But power is at the heart of it, and grassroots desire to protect is often harvested by external factors to seek profit or power, even if they care very little about thought and expression. The methods used to spread the warnings that make censors powerful, that makes us think about them, that makes us fear and self-censor, these warnings vary by time, by culture, and by technology, which makes the scariest voices suddenly louder and triggers new waves of calls for well-intended censorship. In sum, if we want to be more effective opponents of censorship, we need to change the way we imagine it and the way we talk about it. We tend to discuss censorship as if it's an aberration, as if the natural state of humanity is one of free expression unless censorship is introduced by some sinister authority. That is not true. We have no cases of societies without censorship. I'm going to repeat that. We have no cases anywhere on earth throughout history of societies without some restrictions on what can be said, who can say it, where, and when. Even in this room, we have such restrictions. If one of you in the audience stood up right now and started shouting the word beluga over and over, beluga, 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 interrupting this lecture, that person would be quickly ushered out and silenced. If I, the speaker, decided to make the entire 20-minute Q&A section be shouting the word beluga over and over, I would not be invited to give this kind of talk again. Silencing something like that does not feel like censorship. It feels like a simple, courteous social contract. And it is. But courteous social contracts are a part of controlling who can say what. And read a description of an early Quaker meeting house, and you will realize there are far freer speech spaces than a lecture hall at the University of Chicago. You can all imagine some sentence that if someone walked up to you and said it, you would want to have the power to make that person shut up and go away. All spaces, all people, and all societies have some impulse to restrict expression, and most have quite a bit of restriction of expression. It is not useful to think of free speech as the norm and censorship as the aberration. I find it more useful to say that censorship is one of the elements of the social periodic table. It's like arsenic. It's in this room, it's in your body right now. But what matters is whether it's here at toxic concentrations or in toxic forms. We need to understand how it works. What makes the impulse to silence build up into toxic concentrations? What catalyzes it to turn from an internal thought to an external action to a disruptive and harmful movement? We have to acknowledge that the impulse to censor isn't the enemy. The impulse to censor is in all of us. It's the structures that turn that impulse to action which make the arsenic lethal. Activist philosophers, Elizabeth Minnick is one of the big ones, and Alexis Shotwell, had developed wonderful vocabulary to address the fact that we, as a culture, are bad at talking about the real causes of real evil. We are very good at talking about intensive evil, concentrated evil, a centralized source of evil, a villain, a bad guy, an evil politician, a bad law, an evil corporation, or an evil government. Our shelves, our screens, our books are full of stories where the world is fixed when the heroes blow up the villain's evil tower. We are bad at talking about extensive evil, evil which has no central actor willing harm, or even any will of harm, where the threat to life and happiness is millions of daily choices, our choice to burn gasoline, our choice to use single-serve plastic, our choice to continue working within old inequalities and old injustices, decisions usually shaped by social infrastructure, which often makes it practically impossible not to commit innumerable daily evils. From climate change to censorship, we know that most evils around us are extensive evils, but they are hard to talk about, to narrate. Even our climate fiction has the heroes focus on taking down one bad leader or one mega-polluting corporation or one evil pollution demon that's killing the nature spirits. Extensive evil is hard to talk about. But in the case of censorship, like in the case of climate change, we need to talk about it because the toxic forms of censorship are combinations of extensive and intensive evil. The extensive evil of innumerable people feeling the impulse to silence, exclude, control, or others feeling fear, feeling the need to vent dissatisfaction, feeling vulnerability. This extensive evil combines with the intensive evil of power-seeking or profit-seeking institutions and individuals who siphon and channel that extensive source of censorious energy, an energy which can make people rich and get people into office. Censorship is both an intensive and an extensive evil, and we need better tools than Orwell and better tools than the imaginary Hollywood version of the Inquisition if we want to understand how this element of the social periodic table transforms from safe to toxic levels. Without a better apparatus, we will never succeed in diminishing the levels of toxic censorship, especially as our permanent information revolution pummels us with the early adopter effect, constantly making the most terrifying voices the loudest and increasing the degree to which the arsenic builds up, the impulse to silence builds up. And that gives me a little bit of a consolation, because we, humanity, have been in a constant information revolution and are constantly assailed by the early adopter effect since 1450. Here's Shakespeare and his audience fretting about fake news in 1610 with the balladmonger scene in The Winter's Tale. Every generation for the last 20 generations has lived in an information revolution, worried about fake news, seen new and scary impulses to censor be harvested by power-seeking and profit-seeking organizations, seen scary voices grown more powerful, and every generation for 20 generations has felt like it was the end of the world. We're not alone. Understanding censorship enough to defend expression, freedom, and our institutions, such as this one, which advance the light of human inquiry, has a lot of allies from the past. People who have faced this, battled this, lived through this, and above all described this, and whose observations of the patterns of how censorship has worked and how censorship has been circumvented can empower us to be the best prepared generation that has ever battled censorship, and to help fulfill our duty to leave the next generation even better prepared to carry on what will be an ongoing and constant human experience. And with that hopeful thought, I will first briefly mention that I curated an exhibit on the history of censorship in Regenstein a few years ago, and we made a catalog, and if you email me, I will send you a PDF of the catalog with all these great images and lots more great images of censored things. So please do email me if you want that, and with what time remains, I will welcome your questions. Thank you. I love the edition of 1984 on the right there, printed pre-censored. How are we doing the Q&A?
Oh, so I'll ask the question.
Great. Do we have a mic for the questioner, or are we handing them back and forth?
I think that I will speak up. I'm curious about the mirror image of censorship, the way that censorship contributes to creative response. There is a rabbinic saying, know how to respond to the Epicurean, which became the framework for everyone reading the Epicurean as an excuse to respond to them, but learning about them. There is, of course, the famous example of Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, which some argue is written as a cover for his Principles of Philosophy. So that's the opposite of everything that you presented here.
So, and I work on a lot of work written under censorship as well. There's a nice Borges quote. Borges saying that censorship stimulates the necessity of creativity. And I'm teaching a course right now on censored post-World War II Japanese comic books and how they use science fiction to sneak through political commentary that was not allowed to be in more serious press. And here I think about the factor that is poetry. Imposing constraints on creativity stimulates a certain type of coming up with clever things to do within that constraint. And when you talk to poets who write within a very strict formula, when you write a sonnet is beautiful because of the restrictions upon it. And you can do unique and excellent things within that sonnet structure that will not be done anywhere else. But a different poetic structure, so long as it imposes different interesting rules to play with, will create just as stimulating a poem. And I would argue that if the sonnet had never been invented, but different poetic forms had, we would not have sonnets, but we would have different awesome poems written by poets working with different constraints. Censorship, like the sonnet, is indeed a set of constraints that imposes creativity, but it does not create more creativity than writing to a different set of constraints, be that set of constraints the number of episodes in a network television series, or the number of pages in a comic book, or the lack of availability of yellow ink which could mix with blue ink to make green in early printed book art. All of those imposed restrictions stimulated creativity. That doesn't, in the same way censorship does, but censorship also causes harm. If it were the case that somehow the sonnet also caused harm, I would say it was a bad thing that we have sonnets and we should all write a different poetic form. And so similarly, I say those artists who have been creative under censorship would have been just as creative under different interesting constraints. And it's better to use a set of different interesting constraints that does not also cause harm. I don't think censorship increases creativity. I think it simply requires it.
Thank you very much for your lecture. So many things I'd like to talk with you about. I've been working on lawsuits in the United States where petitions to school boards where they've been arguing to ban the Bible on the grounds of violence and vulgarity, both in Florida and in the state of Idaho. There's just a lot of interesting, Salt Lake in Utah. But I want to ask just definitionally a couple things. As a historian, how do you know motive? And how can you be sure?
Yeah.
So those who say we don't intend to harm, we're actually to protect, do we credit that? A second is, in terms of the varieties of options of various things that people do with information, some of your examples have to do with editing. When is it editing and when is it censoring, for example? And at the end, when you spoke about censorship being a societal universal, some of the things that I wanted to add were, for example, the act of criticism in its multiple senses, the act of discernment, of critical discernment, the act of valuation. Where does that begin and end? Where does censorship come into that? I mean, could we say that human beings and societies need to make discerning judgments about what we should talk about how we should organize life, but it isn't always an act of censorship at the same time? So the definitional issues I'm really interested in. And then thirdly, just last of all, because I'm an ancient person.
Yes.
Well,
why don't you let me do the first ones,
okay,
so I remember them.
Yeah.
So the first one was about how do we know motive?
Yeah.
So indeed, we can't know motive from what people say. We can look at what people say and say this is the motive that they want people to think they have, or if it's private text like a diary that they're telling themselves they have. But we always need to double check that against action, right? When the inquisitors say our goal is to destroy this book, and then the inquisitor's action is to sit down with this book for 30 hours and painstakingly alter the book, that shows us that there is an inconsistency between the stated goal and the real lived action. There are indeed, the historian desperately wants a time-traveling telepath bot that can go tell us what the motives of Gregory VII are when he picks Sappho to be the butt of his censorious anger. But very often when we supplement what people say with what they do, we can get at how does the stated motive cross-examined by the lived action show us something. And when that Jesuit who's using an Erasmus textbook just puts 2 little lines through so that you can still read every word, we know something is different about that person's motive from someone who, while censoring the same textbook, really thoroughly blacks out the whole passage. Because the actions that have followed through are different. And thus it is, I think, in the intersection of statements of motive with records of action, where resources are put, where time is put, where you have actually spent a resource, that we can get through that intersection at what seem to be the real motives, and that's the best the historian can do. For the where is the definitional edge, I think it's very important to revel in there being a very blurry edge to censorship, because usually when people try to have a very strict definition of X is censorship, Y is not, they use it to claim that what they're doing isn't censorship and what other people are doing is. When we think of the battle on the American Library Association's, when we think of the battle on Wikipedia's page on censorship in the US, and the people who want to define censorship as only state action, because then what they're doing to schools and libraries is not censorship. So censorship can and should have definitionally blurry edges that blur into editing, that also blur into propaganda, which is another sphere where the border between this and censorship is. And it's on those blurry edges that we can most often have fruitful examination. So I'm going to describe the changes made in the US localization of a Japanese mid-90s cartoon show, anime, because as I list them, you will feel your brain subdividing them between censorship, not censorship, censorship again, censorship I disagree with. And it's the emotional process of thinking through, what does it feel like, what feels like censorship to you, what doesn't feel like censorship to you, that helps us think about this. And I think the best way to study is to follow along that blurry edge and settle on those things that are edgeist, to then ask ourselves how we can make an apparatus to facilitate the good sides and not the bad. So when Warner Brothers licensed Cardcaptor Sakura, a girls' cartoon with a strong female protagonist, executives at Warner Brothers decided that they didn't think a female protagonist would be successful in getting kids to watch this cartoon, that they wanted to have a male protagonist. So they took the episodes and they edited them down super heavily, cutting enormous amounts of footage of the main character in order to make the male love interest / rival character into the main character, removing segments of the heroine, sometimes mushing 3 or 4 episodes into one to get enough footage of him to minimize her. That was an act of editing, but it also very much feels like it's on the borderlands of censorship as we watch a very feminist work being turned into an unfeminist work. In the same editing job, they also took all the same-sex couples and turned them into cousins. And the show, as aired on television, is full of cousins who are really close to each other and hug each other a lot, which again, we recognize and easily place within the sphere of censorship, whereas the gender switch feels censorious but slightly less clearly censorship, right? It's easier to say it's definitely censorship with the cousins than with the boy becoming the protagonist. They also removed the element of the show which has a positively depicted romance between an 8-year-old elementary school girl and her 27-year-old teacher, which is presented as cute, adorable, romantic, and positive in the original and was excised from the US version. And when we get to that detail, we suddenly feel differently, because we also don't think that it's appropriate for a kid's show to endorse what will inevitably turn into statutory rape if the relationship continues. So that kind of example is the best kind of example, because it makes us test ourselves. It makes us think, if I had been in that office, at what point would I have raised my voice in protest? What would I have said? Do I categorize all 3 of these changes as definitely censorship, or are the latter 2 censorship and the first one editing? That blurry space is where we get the richest feeling of what censorship is to us, where it feels uncomfortable, where we get to the, wait a minute, even I might make that decision. If you were in the room at Warner Brothers and asked, do we cut the romance between the 8-year-old and the 27-year-old, your decision would be much harder than your decision about, do we erase the same-sex couples? And it's in those blurry, weird edge cases, like Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche versus Wilfred Owen's brother, which are cases of editing, but cases of editing with a particular agenda, that I think we learn the most about what makes censorship turn from there is arsenic in your body right now to arsenic is killing us in our society. All right, now ask your antiquity question.
Well, do you have other hands?
There are some others.
Yeah. I'll cede to the next.
Okay.
We have
Thank you. I'll
time
follow up with
for just a couple more. Aaron?
Thank you. Thank you. So the question is, first I want to confirm if you think that there are legitimate cases or causes for censorship. For example, the war, editing out troop movements and so forth. Maybe you could answer that quickly.
So I think there's a difference between legitimate and utilitarian, because legitimate is a philosophical question. When is it ethically a good idea? Should we allow free speech to ever be infringed? The practical question is, are there moments when censoring something saves or improves lives? The answer to the second question is definitely yes, but we have to look at whether it saves and protects more lives than are harmed by the other stuff that will inevitably be censored by the same apparatus, because censorship systems are always reused to censor more stuff than they originally did. So, for example, did the anti-sedition laws in New Zealand during World War II help defeat the Nazis? A little bit, yes. But then they were used to break the back of unionization and exploit the dock workers. So is that net worth it? Is the percentage of the contribution of that anti-sedition law to the defeat of the Axis a greater good than letting those dock workers thrive? And, you know, the Axis, let's imagine it means the Axis is still defeated, but it takes another 4 months. Are the lives lost in that 4 months more or less worth balancing against the people who are crushed in the dock workers' strike? Those are the utilitarian calculations we have to make about real applied, is censorship worth it? And is very rarely what we discuss. Censorship discussions tend to be very lofty and abstract, right? And there's the old UChicago joke of, well, that sounds great in practice, but how does it work in theory? We do a lot of discussion of censorship in theory. And in theory, free speech is absolutely best. In practice, free speech doesn't exist. So the question then becomes, how do we try to optimize the systems that we have that silence and censor to be as constructive as possible and as undestructive as possible? And I think by reframing it as a question of optimization and minimization of harm, instead of as a question of absolute principle, we empower ourselves to take actions that are just more effective in the real world. Should we continue to debate the absolute principle? Absolutely. But I think we need more discussion of the applied question, because it's never a question of going from absolute free speech to there is censorship, nor is it ever a question of is it right to censor X? Censoring X always leads to creating an apparatus which will be used to censor Y. And therefore, no matter what it is, you need to keep that in mind. There is no real unique censorship.
I am in the unfortunate position of being the timekeeping censor. And so I'm afraid I have to call this absolutely fascinating session and to direct us all to the common room on the first floor where we have a meal waiting, and to ask all of you to join me in thanking Ada for this wonderful session.